The winter air hung heavy and silent over the sprawling city park, the kind of biting cold that usually drove people into the warmth of their homes or the bustle of crowded cafes. Yet tonight the park was not entirely abandoned. Snow had begun to fall an hour ago, dusting the iron lampposts and the frozen walkways in a layer of pristine white, creating a hushed atmosphere that felt removed from the chaotic rhythm of the metropolis surrounding it. Sitting alone on a wooden bench that had been cleared of the fresh powder was Junho, a man whose sharp, tailored suit was far too expensive for a casual evening in the cold, and whose dark wool coat did little to hide the rigid, imposing posture of someone who spent his life expecting an attack. He was a figure of immense power in the shadows of the city, a Korean mafia boss who commanded armies of men with a single whisper, yet here, under the amber glow of the street lamp, he was simply a silhouette of profound isolation. He stared at the frozen pond before him, his breath misting in the air, lost in a contemplative silence that was suddenly broken by the crunch of boots on snow. Approaching him was a woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, dressed in an elegant beige coat that screamed high-status professional, yet her eyes held a vulnerability that betrayed her impeccably put-together appearance. This was Elena, a CEO who had conquered the corporate ladder but found the view from the top to be suffocatingly lonely. She hesitated for a moment, clutching her designer bag with trembling hands, watching the dangerous-looking man who radiated a do-not-disturb aura. But the crushing weight of her own solitude was heavier than her fear. She took a breath that rattled in her chest, stepped into his line of sight, and with tears welling in her eyes, she spoke the words that had been clawing at her throat all evening. "I don't have a boyfriend. Can I spend a day with you?" she asked, her voice cracking with a mixture of desperation and hope, the absurdity of the request hanging in the freezing air between them. Junho turned his head slowly, his dark eyes narrowing as he assessed the woman standing before him, his instincts instantly scanning for threats, wires, or weapons, but finding only a woman who looked as though she was shattering from the inside out. He was accustomed to people approaching him with fear, with greed, or with deceit, but never with such a raw, unvarnished plea for simple companionship. The silence stretched out, filled only by the soft sound of falling snow and the distant hum of traffic as he processed her request. He saw the way her knuckles were white from gripping her bag, the way the cold wind whipped a stray curl of dark hair across her face, and the undeniable sincerity in her tear-filled gaze. "You do not know who I am," Junho said, his voice a low baritone that rumbled with a warning, yet lacked the usual malice he reserved for his enemies. Elena shook her head, a tear finally escaping and tracing a warm path down her cold cheek. "I don't care who you are," she replied, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. I have everything, and I have nothing. I didn't want to be alone tonight." Please, it was a confession of weakness that a woman of her stature would never admit in a boardroom, but out here in the anonymity of the winter night, the armor had fallen away. Junho looked at the empty space on the bench beside him, then back at her. He saw a reflection of his own hollowness in her eyes, the successful professional who had traded connection for power, the lonely soul trapped in a cage of their own making. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his weight and nodded once, a subtle invitation that bridged the gap between their two vastly different worlds. "Sit," he commanded softly, the word less of an order and more of an offering. As Elena sat down, maintaining a respectful distance, the dynamic of the evening shifted from a chance encounter to a shared pact against the encroaching darkness of their lives. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the only communication being the shared experience of the winter chill and the strange comfort of a stranger's presence. Elena found herself relaxing for the first time in years, the knot of anxiety that permanently resided in her chest beginning to loosen in the presence of this stoic, silent man. She watched the snow collect on the shoulders of his dark coat and felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to explain herself, to justify why a CEO of a Fortune 500 company was begging a stranger for time. "I work 80 hours a week," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds. "I have 3 assistants, a driver, and a penthouse I rarely see. Today was my birthday, and the only person who wished me a happy birthday was my bank's automated email system." The admission hung in the air, stark and pathetic in her own ears, but Junho did not laugh. Instead, he turned to face her fully, his expression softening in a way that would have terrified his subordinates, for they had never seen their boss look at anyone with empathy. "I have 1,000 men who would die for me," Junho replied, his voice carrying the weight of his violent legacy. "But I cannot remember the last time someone asked to sit with me without wanting a favor or a promotion. It was a rare exchange of truths, two titans of their respective industries stripping away the titles and the accolades to reveal the human beings underneath." The connection was instantaneous and terrifyingly deep, rooted in the shared understanding of the cost of success. Junho stood up abruptly, the movement fluid and powerful, causing Elena to look up in surprise. "It is too cold to sit," he stated, buttoning his coat. "If you want to spend the day, or what is left of it, we should not freeze to death." He extended a gloved hand toward her, a gesture of old-world chivalry that seemed at odds with the dangerous energy he emitted. Elena looked at his hand, then at his face, and for the first time that night, a genuine smile touched her lips as she reached out and took it. They walked through the park and out onto the city streets, the winter evening transforming the urban landscape into a glistening wonderland of lights and reflections. Junho adjusted his pace to match hers, a subtle consideration that Elena noticed and appreciated. They found themselves wandering toward a night market that was bustling with life despite the cold, the air thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and sweet pancakes. It was a place Elena usually experienced only from the back seat of her limousine, a blur of color and noise she was too busy to engage with. Now, walking beside Junho, she felt immersed in the vibrancy of it all. He steered her toward a stall selling hotteok, the sweet Korean pancakes steaming on the griddle. "You have eaten?" he asked, and Elena realized she hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. She shook her head. Junho bought 2, handing one to her wrapped in a paper cup. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers, a physical manifestation of the warmth growing between them. As she took a bite, the sweet, molten sugar filling burst in her mouth, and she let out a sound of pure delight that made Junho's lips twitch upward. "Simple things are often the most expensive to afford," he mused, watching the crowd moving around them. He was vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, his body acting as a subtle shield between Elena and the jostling crowd. She noticed how people instinctively moved out of his way, parting like the sea before him, sensing the authority he carried. "You're constantly watching," Elena observed, wiping a bit of sugar from her lip. "Is it exhausting?"
Being.
"Whatever you are." She still didn't know the specifics, but the expensive suit, the scars on his knuckles, and the way he moved told a story she was beginning to piece together. "Peace is a luxury I cannot buy," Junho admitted, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "But for tonight, I am just a man eating a pancake." They continued their walk, leaving the noise of the market for the quieter, cobblestone streets of the historic district, where the old gas lamps cast long, dancing shadows against the brick buildings. The conversation flowed more easily now, moving from the superficial to the philosophical. Elena spoke of her childhood, of the pressure to succeed, of the sacrifices she made to break glass ceilings only to find the air above them too thin to breathe. Junho listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world, his silence not empty, but attentive. He shared fragments of his own life, not the violence or the crime, but the burden of legacy, the weight of family expectations, and the crushing reality of leadership. "We are the same," Elena said softly, stopping to look at a display in a closed shop window. Different worlds, but the same cage. It was a moment of profound recognition. They were 2 lonely sovereigns, ruling over their respective empires, but lacking a court to call home. As they stood there, a sudden gust of wind howled through the alley, blowing snow fiercely around them. Elena shivered violently, her beige coat insufficient against the dropping temperature. Without hesitation, Junho unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. The garment was heavy, smelling of expensive cologne, tobacco, and the crisp winter air. The warmth of Junho's coat was a heavy, grounding weight on Elena's shoulders, a stark contrast to the biting wind that swirled through the narrow alleyway of the historic district, and as they emerged into a small, cobblestone plaza, the atmosphere shifted from the intimate silence of their walk to a scene of unexpected innocence. In the center of the plaza, Illuminated by the soft glow of fairy lights strung between the trees, a young girl of no more than 6 years old was packing snow into a lopsided mound, her bright pink snowsuit a vivid splash of color against the monochrome night. She seemed entirely unbothered by the cold or the late hour, humming a tune to herself while a frantic-looking woman, presumably her mother, was distracted by a phone call a few yards away. As Elena and Junho approached, the little girl stopped her work and looked up, her eyes wide and piercingly intelligent, fixing her gaze not on Elena, but on the imposing figure of Junho. Most children would have shied away from the scar on his brow or the dangerous stillness that defined his presence, but this child simply tilted her head, her curiosity overriding any instinct for caution. She waddled over to them, the snow crunching loudly under her small boots, and pointed a mitten-covered hand at the oversized coat draped over Elena. "That is too big for you," the child stated with the absolute, unshakable confidence that only the very young possess, her breath puffing out in small white clouds. Elena chuckled, a genuine, bubbling sound that surprised even herself. "Yes, it is," Elena replied, crouching down to be at eye level with the girl. "My friend lent it to me because I was cold." The little girl looked from Elena to Junho, her gaze scrutinizing the Mafia boss who had frozen statues of men with a single glare. "He is not cold?" she asked, looking at Junho's suit jacket, which was far too thin for the freezing temperature. Junho, who had faced down armed hitmen without blinking, looked momentarily struck by the child's direct concern. He slowly crouched down as well, his movements careful and deliberate, bringing himself to the girl's level. "I am used to the cold, little one," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle rumble that lacked its usual sharp edge. The girl frowned, unsatisfied with this answer, and reached out to pat his knee with her snowy mitten. "Nobody is used to the cold," she corrected him with profound simplicity. "You just forgot how to be warm because you gave away your shell." The words hung in the air, piercing through the layers of pretense they had both been wearing. It was a devastatingly accurate observation that stripped Junho of his tough exterior and exposed the sacrificial nature of his earlier gesture. He stared at the child, his dark eyes widening slightly, realizing that this innocent soul had seen through the carefully constructed armor of the boss to the man underneath who was willing to freeze so another could be comfortable. The child's mother quickly hurried over, apologizing profusely and ushering the girl away, but the echo of the interaction lingered long after the plaza fell silent again, leaving Elena and Junho standing in the aftermath of the unintentional truth bomb. They walked to a nearby stone bench that had been cleared of snow, the mood between them shifting from casual companionship to something deeper and more vulnerable. Elena pulled the coat tighter around herself, not just for warmth now, but as if trying to physically hold onto the shell the child had mentioned. "She was right, you know," Elena said softly, breaking the silence as they sat down, the distance between them on the bench significantly smaller than it had been at the park hours ago. "You act like you're made of stone, Junho, but you're just." Waiting, Junho leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at his clasped hands. The encounter with the child had unearthed a buried ache in his chest, a longing for a life he had disqualified himself from the moment he took his blood oath. "In my world," he began, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "to be warm is to be weak. If I show I feel the cold, my enemies will burn me." He turned his head to look at her, and the street lamp caught the raw honesty in his expression. "But looking at that child, I realized I have built an empire of ice. I have money, power, respect. But I do not have anyone to worry if I am cold." Elena felt a lump form in her throat, recognizing the mirror image of her own life in his words. She had chased the corner office and the title of CEO, sacrificing relationships and family on the altar of ambition, only to find that success was a cold bedfellow. "I wanted that," Elena whispered, tears pricking her eyes again, though this time they weren't from sadness, but from release. "I wanted a little girl in a pink snowsuit. I wanted to be the one distracted on the phone while my family played. But I told myself I didn't have time. I told myself next year, next promotion, next deal. And now, I'm just a woman in a borrowed coat." It was a moment of shared grief for the lives they hadn't lived, a mourning of the paths not taken. Junho reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before covering hers where it rested on the bench. His skin was cold, but his touch was electric, a bridge between their two lonely islands. "It is not too late," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his own doubts. "Tonight, at least, we are not a CEO and a criminal. We are just two people trying to find the warmth." As the night deepened and the city began to settle into the darkest hours before dawn, the reality of Junho's dangerous existence threatened to shatter the fragile bubble of normalcy they had created. A sleek black sedan rolled slowly past the plaza, its tinted windows impenetrable, and Elena felt Junho's entire demeanor shift instantly. The muscles in his arm coiled tight beneath his shirt, and his gaze sharpened into a lethal instrument as he tracked the vehicle. He withdrew his hand from hers, the loss of contact immediate and jarring, and stood up, placing his body subtly between her and the street. The car didn't stop, eventually turning a corner and disappearing, but the spell was broken, replaced by the adrenaline of survival. "You should go," Junho said, his voice reverting to the clipped, commanding tone of the boss, though his eyes betrayed a desperate desire for her to stay. "It is not safe for you to be seen with me. The day you asked for. It is dangerous." He was trying to push her away, to retreat behind his walls to protect her, a noble but heartbreaking reflex. Elena stood up, the oversized coat swaying around her ankles, and looked him dead in the eye, refusing to be dismissed like a subordinate. "I asked for a day," she stated firmly, stepping into his personal space until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "A day is 24 hours, Junho. We have hours left. I am not afraid of your world because, for the first time in 10 years, I don't feel afraid of being alone." She saw the conflict warring within him, the instinct to protect her versus the selfish, human need to keep her close. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the strength that had propelled her to the top of her industry, a resilience that matched his own. "They will not understand you," he warned, gesturing vaguely to the city that slept around them, implying the judgment of society, the danger of his rivals, and the impossibility of their pairing. "I am a monster to them." Elena reached out and took his hand again, pulling it back to her, defying the invisible threats that surrounded him. "Then let them look," she challenged, squeezing his fingers. "Because right now, you're the only person who saw me when I was invisible." It was a declaration of loyalty that stunned him. In his line of work, loyalty was bought with blood or money, never given freely by a stranger in a beige dress. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension draining from his shoulders as he accepted her decision. "Okay," he whispered, surrendering to the connection. "Then we will finish the day." They decided to escape the suffocating grid of the city streets, hailing a cab. Junho refused to use his own drivers, wanting to keep this pocket of time uncontaminated by his organization, and heading toward the harbor, a place where the skyline met the sea. They walked along the pier as the sky began to lighten, the ink-black darkness slowly giving way to a bruised purple and deep blue. The water lapped rhythmically against the wooden pilings, a soothing, repetitive sound that filled the silence between them. They didn't speak much during this final stretch. Words felt unnecessary, redundant in the face of the profound emotional shift that had occurred over the last few hours. They stopped at the railing, looking out at the horizon where the sun was threatening to breach, marking the end of their stolen time. Elena leaned against the railing, the sea breeze whipping her hair, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. "I used to think that if I stopped running, everything would fall apart," she mused, watching a seagull glide over the water. "That if I wasn't the CEO, I was nothing." Junho stood beside her, his profile sharp against the dawn. "And now?" he asked. "Now," she turned to him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I think the most important meeting I ever had was on a park bench with a stranger." Junho turned to face her, and the rising sun caught the side of his face, illuminating him not as a figure of fear, but as a man who had found a moment of redemption. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin, a lucky charm he had carried for years, a talisman of survival in his violent world. He took her hand and pressed the cold metal into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "I cannot give you a normal life, Elena," Junho continued, his voice rough with a mixture of regret and fierce determination as he pressed the silver coin deep into her palm, curling her fingers over it one by one. "My world is made of shadows and sharp edges, and it destroys everything soft that touches it. But this is a promise. As long as you have this, you are never truly alone." You are under my protection, even if I cannot stand beside you. The first rays of the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of violent orange and soft pink, signaling the end of their suspended reality. The city behind them began to stir, the distant rumble of delivery trucks and early commuters breaking the sacred silence they had shared. Elena looked down at the coin, feeling the warmth of his hand lingering on the metal, and then looked back up at him. She realized that the day she had begged for was over. The 24 hours were up, and the pumpkin was turning back into a carriage, or in this case, the magical connection was about to be severed by the demands of their respective stations. Slowly, with a heaviness in her movements that had nothing to do with fatigue, she reached up and unbuttoned the heavy wool coat that had shielded her from the winter night. As she slid it off her shoulders, the cold morning air hit her silk dress, biting and sharp, but she found she didn't shiver. The warmth Junho had ignited within her, the validation of being seen, the comfort of shared vulnerability, radiated from the inside out, providing a shield far stronger than wool or cashmere. She held the coat out to him, a symbolic return of his armor. "I don't need a normal life," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I just needed to know that I wasn't the only one trapped in a glass tower. You gave me more than a day, Junho. You gave me permission to be human again." Junho took the coat, his fingers brushing against hers, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through them both, searing the moment into their memories. He didn't put the coat back on. Instead, he draped it over his arm, as if putting it back on would erase the openness he had achieved with her. "Go," he said softly, the single word laden with the pain of letting her go. "Before the city wakes up and tries to tell us who we are supposed to be." Elena turned and walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the wooden planks of the pier, a sound that echoed like a countdown. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to run back to the dangerous man with the sad eyes, to beg for another hour, another minute. But she kept walking, clutching the silver coin in her hand so tightly it left an imprint on her skin. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that if she saw him standing there alone against the sunrise, she would never be able to leave. Behind her, Junho watched her figure recede, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never did during a raid or a negotiation. He waited until she turned the corner and vanished from sight before he finally allowed himself to exhale, the breath shuddering out of him as a cloud of white mist. He looked at the empty space beside him, then at the rising sun which illuminated a world that looked different than it had yesterday. It was no longer just a battlefield to be conquered or a territory to be defended. It was a place where she existed. A sleek black car pulled up silently to the curb 100 yards away, his men finally moving in to retrieve him now that the civilian was gone. Junho put on his coat, buttoning it all the way to the top, sealing himself back into the role of the ruthless kingpin. But as he walked toward the car, his hand went to his pocket, not to check for his weapon, but to touch the empty space where his lucky coin used to be. He had given away his luck, but in exchange, he had found something far more valuable, a tether to his own humanity. The engine purred as he slid into the back seat, the driver glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at the boss's unreadable expression. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. Junho looked out the window at the spot where Elena had disappeared. "No," he murmured, closing his eyes. "Take the long way. I want to see the city." He needed time to memorize the streets she walked, to reconcile the monster he was with the man she had spent the day with, knowing that while they were separating now, the gravity of their encounter had altered their orbits forever. 3 months had passed since that winter night, and the biting frost of the city had given way to the tentative, hopeful green of early spring. In the glass-walled corner office on the 45th floor, Elena sat behind her massive mahogany desk, but the atmosphere of the room had fundamentally changed. Gone was the frantic, terrified energy of assistants scurrying to avoid her wrath. Instead, there was a calm, focused efficiency. Elena was reviewing a merger contract, but her hand rested on a small, silver coin that sat atop a stack of papers, using it as a paperweight. It was her anchor. Whenever the loneliness threatened to creep back in, whenever the pressure of the boardroom felt like it was crushing her lungs, she would touch the cool metal and remember the steam of the hadiak, the weight of the wool coat, and the voice that had told her she wasn't alone. She checked her watch. It was 5 p.m. In the past, this would have been the middle of her workday, a time when she was just revving up for another 6 hours of grinding isolation. Today, however, she closed the folder, capped her pen, and stood up. Her assistant, a young man named Marcus who used to flinch when she said his name, looked up in surprise as she emerged from her office with her coat over her arm. "Ms. Elena?" he asked, unsure. Are you leaving for the day?" "The conference call with Tokyo is in 3 hours," Elena smiled, a genuine, warm expression that still caught her staff off guard. "Reschedule it, Marcus," she said lightly. "Tell them I have a prior engagement. And go home to your family. The work will be here tomorrow." She walked out of the suite, leaving a stunned silence in her wake, and took the elevator down, bypassing her waiting driver to step out into the crisp spring evening. She needed to walk. She needed to return to the source. Her feet carried her instinctively back to the park, the landscape now softened by blooming cherry blossoms and the golden light of the setting sun. It was the same park, yet it felt entirely different without the shroud of winter snow. Families were picnicking on the grass, couples were walking hand in hand, and the air was filled with laughter rather than silence. Elena navigated through the paths, her heart beating a little faster with every step, drawn by a magnetic pulse she couldn't explain. She reached the frozen pond, now thawed and reflecting the pink hues of the sky, and looked toward the bench. Their bench. It was occupied. Sitting there, looking out at the water with the same stillness she remembered, was Junho. He wasn't wearing the heavy winter coat, but a sharp, dark suit that fit him perfectly, yet he looked less like a fortress and more like a man at peace. He wasn't checking his phone, he wasn't scanning the perimeter for threats. He was simply waiting. It was as if he knew, with the same certainty that the tide knows the moon, that she would come back today. Elena stopped a few feet away, the breath catching in her throat. She hadn't called him. They had exchanged no numbers, no promises of a reunion, only the coin. Yet here he was. Junho turned his head slowly, and when his eyes met hers, the recognition was immediate and devastatingly tender. He didn't smile in the conventional sense, but the tension around his eyes evaporated, replaced by a warmth that was reserved solely for her. Elena approached the bench, the sound of her heels announcing her presence, just as they had that first night. "I didn't think you'd be here," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she stood before him. Junho stood up, respecting the gravity of the moment, and faced her. "I have come here every Tuesday at 5 p.m., he revealed, his voice low and honest. Just in case the coin was not enough, the admission floored her. The image of this powerful, dangerous man sitting on a park bench week after week, waiting for the woman who had asked for a day, was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Elena looked at him, seeing the subtle changes. He looked less weary, less haunted, as if their one day had given him permission to breathe as well. "I don't need a day anymore," Elena said, clarifying her request from months ago, realizing that her initial plea had been a bandage for a wound that was now healing. "I don't want to just spend a day with you, Junho. I want to know you. The real you. Not the boss, not the protector. Just you." Junho reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and familiar, grounding her instantly. He looked at the woman who had braved his world with nothing but vulnerability and saw the only future that mattered. "Then sit," he said, echoing his first invitation, but this time his tone was filled with hope rather than resignation. "We have time." As they sat down together, the distance between them non-existent, the sun dipped below the horizon, not marking an end, but a beginning. The lonely CEO and the isolated kingpin sat side by side, watching the city lights flicker on, no longer two solitary figures fighting the cold, but a family of two who had found their way home.